Thank you, worship team. Good morning. It's great to see everybody this morning, braving the yucky weather, but we need the rain. So great to have those of y'all who are here with us. Those of you online, thanks for joining us. Thanks for finding us. We had a little bit of technical trouble with our online and our website this morning, but things are a little bit better than they were when we started out the day about 6 o'clock. So anyway, welcome to everyone that's able to join us one way or another. If you're here this morning and you're a guest, if this is your first time, or maybe you've been here a few times and checking us out, I just want to say thanks for joining us and welcome to our service. Make yourself at home. We do have connection cards in the pocket of the seat in front of you. If you'd like to fill one of these out, if you're a guest, we'd love to just know a little bit about who you are. Feel free to share whatever you want with us, as much or as little. There's an offering box in the back of the sanctuary. You can just drop it in there on your way out. If you're online, there's an online connection on our website. Just migrate over to there, and that's available to you there. And I always tell you, if you're a regular around here, you can always use these cards for prayer requests, questions, concerns, ideas, thoughts, anything you need to communicate with me or our staff or our leaders. We want to hear from you, and we want to pray for you, especially if you have prayer needs. So use those for that as well. Let me jump into just a couple of announcements before we jump into our scripture this morning. First, we got a meeting tonight. We call them all church meetings. Whoops. Did I get that wrong? There we go. All church meeting tonight. Every now and then we just need to have a conversation as a church, and so we just have all church meetings. And what we're talking about tonight is some of our strategic planning. We've been in a strategic planning process for over a year now. And so our team has rolled out some objectives. They're in draft form. You should have gotten a link to those in your newsletter this week. And we just want to walk through them, explain some of those objectives to you, take your questions and your comments and your ideas as we just move the process forward of developing those strategic objectives, which are going to guide us for the next few years. So join us here at 5 o'clock in the sanctuary. We'll have copies of those printed if you don't have a digital version with you. If you need to join us online, we will be streaming that. So you just go over to however you would join us online normally on a Sunday morning, and you'll find us here tonight at 5 o'clock, assuming everything is working, which we plan for it to be. The other thing is small groups. Our small groups are getting ready to start the end of this month and 1st of October, depending on the group. Those are live now. You can just go over to our website and check those out. You can sign up on the Sign Up Genius there. You can scan the QR code that's in front of you, in the seat in front of you. Just scan that with your phone, and that'll take you to a link to our small groups, and you can check all of those out. But I hope you'll find a small group and plug into it. It's a great way to grow together. It's a great way to get to know other people. If you're interested in serving, it's sometimes a great way to start serving alongside of people that you're in small group with. And I want to put a bug in your ear about one of our small groups. One of our most consistent small groups and fastest growing small group has been what we call our young adult small group. And that's a big reason for that is Lex and Jessica invested heavily in that group in our church. Lex left our staff. He finished up last week. And so they were hosting that group, and he was facilitating that group with some other leaders within that group. So that group's not meeting this semester because we're trying to have to figure out where we're going to do that group and who's going to facilitate it. But if you're interested in hosting a group, whether it's the young adult group or any other group, we would love to talk to you about just opening up your home, opening up your space for a group to meet in. And you don't have to be a young adult to host the young adults. You just need a couch and some chairs and some space and maybe know how to make some coffee, and then you could host the young adults. They typically meet in the middle of the week because that's the best for their schedule. So just think about that and find a group to join. And then one last thing is just in terms of just volunteers. There's a couple of areas where we need some volunteers. And so if you're not serving somewhere on a regular basis, I want to invite you to think about serving in one of these areas. And the first area is in our kids ministry. Our kids ministry was hit hard, like most churches, when COVID hit, and we're still bouncing back from that and working on it. But we need volunteers in our nursery area for our kids ministry, the Itty Bitties. And so we would love to talk to you about joining it. You know, I was, and this is something that's happening in churches across the board. I was at a church while Marcia and I were on vacation over the summer, and it's a pretty large church. And it was so interesting. They meet in a big rec center, and we were in this large room for worship, and there was a lobby outside. And I didn't notice it going in, but on my way out, as I was walking out the doors, I'm staring straight at another door, which was their nursery door. and it was closed, and there was a sign on it that said, "No nursery due to no volunteers." And I felt bad for them, but I kind of smiled because I was like, okay, we're not the only ones, right? So I don't want to have to put a sign on the door as you come in one Sunday that says no nursery because of no volunteers. So we would love to talk to you. I would love to connect you with Elise, if you don't know who Elise is, our children's pastor, and just help you figure out how you might serve there. The other area is back in our tech booth. This is one of the important areas for our worship ministry because so many people join us online every week, especially people who are looking for a new church. Most people are coming in online before they ever come in person when they're checking out a church. So that's a real important area. Lex was one of our techs. He was our backup. And we already had a couple of holes in the schedule. So what we ask our techs to do is just take one Sunday a month. Maybe the first Sunday, the second Sunday, but it's a fixed Sunday, so you know when you're serving. And if you can't serve, they kind of rotate around and trade off spots with each other. But we need a couple of people to help with our computers and our video system. And we call it a technical ministry because it is, but it's not that technical. It's not that difficult. Anybody can learn it and do it. In fact, we have, how old is Mickey? Mickey is 8, Joe and Carrie's son. Mickey runs our computer for our worship team for rehearsal every morning before you all get here. If Mickey at 8 can do it, the rest of us can do it, okay? And Mickey never misses a beat. And so he's probably better than most of us. So you can do this, and we need your help doing it. And even if you can't take one Sunday a month, if you could just say, hey, I'll be a backup and jump in when people need it, or I'll just take the 5th Sunday, because we don't have anybody on the 5th Sundays, and those things roll around every now and then, and so we need some extra support there. So think about serving in one of those areas, and if you have any questions about that, I'd love to talk to you. So let's go to God in prayer before we jump into Scripture. God, thank you for this church. Thank you for just everybody who makes it possible to do what we do and to lead in our community and in our world the way that we lead. We just thank you for the resources you give to us. We thank you for all of the volunteers that you give to help us just reach our mission of serving you and serving others. And now, God, I just pray you would open our hearts and our minds to the things you want us to hear today, the things you want us to know, but more importantly, the things you want us to do with what we know. In Christ's name I pray, amen. So we are starting a brand new series this morning. It's a 2-week series. We're going to start it today, finish it next week, and we're calling it Toxic People and What to Do About Them, right? Toxic people and what do you do about them? Now, before we jump in and start talking about this, I want to be really, really clear about what it is to be a toxic person, what makes someone toxic, because just because you don't get along with someone, or maybe just because someone's difficult or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean they're toxic, okay? So here are a couple things just to keep in mind as we start this conversation this week and next. But the first one is that you're going to have people in your life where their personalities, they just kind of clash with your personality, right? You just kind of butt heads or whatever. We all have people that we naturally get along with. We also have people that where our personalities just clash with them, and it's hard to get along with them. That doesn't make them toxic, okay? So we just need to understand that and understand what toxic is and what it isn't. Also, the second one, and this is important, people are allowed to have bad days, right? I mean, aren't you glad? Because we all have bad days, don't we? It's just fair that people get to have bad days. Occasionally, we all do. I mean, we say things we shouldn't say. We get into arguments. We're moody, right? We do things from time to time because we just have bad days. But that doesn't make you toxic, and it doesn't make other people toxic. A toxic person is somebody who does that all the time, right? So here's the definition I would give you for a toxic person. It's anyone who makes me feel worse about myself with every interaction. Okay, every time I'm with this person, it makes me feel worse about myself or the situation in some ways. Whenever you're around them, you walk away from that person and you feel like you just need to take a shower, right? You ever known somebody like that in your life? Most of us are shaking our heads, so you're already with me. But you do. You're with them and you just feel like all of the energy has just been drained out of you, or you feel like you've been attacked or criticized or disrespected, right? I mean, this person has just become an expert at just sucking the joy out of your life. Toxic person makes me feel worse about myself with every interaction. And so these two messages, this week and next week, don't miss next week, but these two messages, they're going to focus on how do we respond And how do we react to the toxic people in our lives? Because there are people that are in lives and we can't just walk away from them because of the circumstances or the relationship. Now, the reason this is so important is this. If we don't have a plan, and if we're not prepared, and really, as we're gonna see, if we're not proactive in this area, what happens, and we've all experienced this, but the toxic people in our lives, ultimately, they gain a level of control over us, don't they? I mean, and if we're not prepared, before we know it, if we're acting the way that they do, we're reacting the way that they react. And we feel like in the moment that we have no choice, don't we? And the reason it feels like we have no choice is this, that toxic people, without even really meaning to, they keep us off balance. They keep us off balance. We're just off balance, and we don't know, kind of what we're walking into. We don't know how to respond. They kind of lean one way, and we kind of lean the other way. And when we're off balance, what we do is we compensate. And this is why these kinds of relationships, you feel like you're not even yourself sometimes. In fact, somewhere along the way, someone may have said to you, when you're around that person, you're just not you. When you're around that person, you're a different person. Why? Because when you're around these kinds of people, we are forced to compensate. If someone walks up and pushes you off balance, you compensate to regain your balance, don't you? But the problem with a toxic person is it is virtually impossible to keep and maintain your balance when you're around them. Before Marcia and I bought the house that we live in now, 2 years ago, we bought our house. But before that, we lived in another neighborhood for 23 years. And for most of those years, all but about 3 of those years, I think, I served on the board of directors for our homeowner association. Yes, I'm one of those people. One of those people that some of you love to hate, don't you? You're HOA. But I did. And I got on the board because I had a bad experience with the HOA, right? Most people get on their boards that way. And not too long after I got on our board of directors, another neighbor of mine and a friend of mine, his name is Mark, he got on the board too. And we decided that together we were going to make this a great neighborhood and we were going to make this a great HOA, right? We were not going to have a crazy controlling HOA. It took us about 10 years to make that happen, and we did. I still see Mark every now and then at the gym where I work out, and things are still going really well. But it took about 10 years. But there was one person on the board during most of that time, or a lot of that time, that was just toxic. Her name was Kim. And Kim was one of the most unhappiest people I've ever met in my life. She was just an unhappy person. And to her credit, or whatever, the benefit of the doubt, she'd experienced a lot in her life. She'd experienced some trauma in her life. I knew some of her story because I got to know her a little bit and talk to her. Lots of bad things that had happened to her that were beyond her control. She had a terrible relationship with almost all of her extended family. She'd lost some of her extended family under some really, really difficult circumstances. And so it just created a lot of bitterness in her, and that bitterness had become toxic, and it came out as toxic. And so she just became a very, very toxic person. Every interaction with her made me feel worse about the situation whenever I was engaged with her or in a meeting with her. Eventually, things got so bad that the board of directors had to go door to door and ask the community to vote her off of the HOA because it just got so undoable. We just couldn't work anymore. But it didn't end there. I mean, she was constantly sending emails to our management company. She got all of our personal emails, and was sending us emails constantly, passive-aggressive. Most of it was just aggressive, and that sort of thing. And there was no pleasing her. And then the community got a Facebook page, and that was wonderful because now all this stuff starts getting put out for the public to see. She just wasn't a good person. And here's the point, and we all know this, it's so difficult to be good to people who just aren't good people, isn't it? And it doesn't matter what kind of faith you have or where you are in that. In the moment, it's so difficult to be kind to people who just aren't kind people. It's difficult to be sensitive to people who just aren't sensitive to other people. And the golden rule, just doesn't apply here, does it? I mean, the golden rule. We learned this as kids. It was what? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you, right? We learned that growing up. And this is great. This is great until somebody mistreats you. And it's great until somebody mistreats somebody that you care about, somebody that you love. And so suddenly, when that happens, the golden rule is out the window, and now it's the iron rule, isn't it? I mean, you know what the iron rule is. It's do unto others as they have done unto you, right? And that seems fair in this case. In that moment, when you're dealing with a toxic person and they have you off balance, in that moment, it just seems right. It just seems fair. It seems right. It just seems even, doesn't it? And then there's this, that sometimes when we're mistreated in a relationship and we feel powerless to do anything about it, and we're off balance and we're compensating for that being off balance, sometimes we compensate, but not in the relationship with the person that threw us off balance, not with the toxic person. Sometimes we compensate in another relationship. We compensate with somebody else. I'll take it out on you because they took it out on me, because I can't take it out on them because of the circumstances. And then it's this, it's do unto others as someone else has done unto you, isn't it? And haven't we all been here at some level, at some point in our lives? I mean, so here's the question: what do we do? What do we do? What do you do about the toxic people in your life? And there's no way to extricate yourself from the relationship because of the nature of the relationship, but they're just toxic, and they keep you off balance, and you keep compensating. And we love to daydream about what it would be like to get even, don't we? But when we get even, you know what we're doing? We're just getting even with someone that we don't even like. And eventually, that just makes us just like them. So what do we do? I mean, we can't ignore them, right? That's impossible. We can't ignore them, so that's not the way forward. And getting even, that's not really the way forward. Fortunately, there's another way. There's a third option. It's a third option that's not necessarily intuitive to us. It doesn't come naturally to us. It's a third option that actually decreases their power over us. And it's a third option that allows us to guard and protect our hearts, which is what we really need to do when we're around toxic people. And this option, it positions us, when it's all said and done, to be able to tell a much better story in the end. Now, the way forward is taught and modeled by Jesus. No surprise there, right? But it's also taught and modeled by a person in the Old Testament that we're going to look at. They're relatively unknown in the Old Testament, but their lives intersected with the life of David. And if you grew up in church, you're familiar with who David was. The event that we're going to look at today, it doesn't take place with shepherd boy David, and it doesn't take place with eventual King David. It takes place with when he was fugitive David. And David, you remember, he killed Goliath. And after he killed Goliath, he becomes this national hero. I mean, everybody loves David. And King Saul, who was a pretty paranoid person by nature, he pulls David in close to him so that he can keep an eye on him. Because again, he's a national hero. Everybody loves David. And so you want to keep your friends close. You want to keep your potential rivals even closer, right? And then King Saul, so he finds out eventually that David, who when he was younger, that a prophet, this rogue prophet, goes to David's home and anoints him as the next king of Israel. So this was supposed to be a secret that Saul finds out about. And that's a big problem if you're the king, right? If you're the current king, because one, you want to continue being the current king. And two, you want your son to be the next king. You want your legacy and your line to continue. In this case, it was Jonathan. So King Saul tries to kill David. Long story short, David escapes into the wilderness. He has to leave his family and his friends and all of that. He's on the run. He's a fugitive. And over time, David kind of builds this following of other men. And I imagine most of them probably had been mistreated in some way under Saul's reign too. And so you got this group of guys, and they're angry about all of this. And David is angry about how he's mistreated. And he's got all of this frustration. And like many of us, he's looking for a place to sort of get that frustration out on, someone to take it out on, because he can't take it out on Saul because he's the king, he's untouchable, he's protected. And in this story, he finds someone who is the perfect candidate. it's a perfect candidate for David to do unto him as has been done unto David. And that's where the story picks up. So I'm going to read just part of the story. We're going to stop kind of in the middle, and we're going to finish it next week. So you're going to have to come back next week to see how all of this ends, unless you want to read it for yourself, and I hope you'll come back next week. But here's what's happened. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 25, so if you've got a Bible and you want to flip to it, if you've got your phone or your iPad or whatever, 1 Samuel 25, if you're online, just going over to Bible Gateway or uversion.com. Those are all great sites for that. But 1 Samuel 25, here's what happens. A certain man in Moab who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had thousands of goats. He had thousands of goats and 3,000 sheep. And we hear that and we read that and we think, well, big deal. He had a bunch of goats and he had a bunch of sheep, right? This guy was rich, okay? I mean, the fact that he had all of this in that culture meant he was wealthy. Just think mansion, garage, and a whole bunch of cars in that garage, okay? This guy was wealthy. So he had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel, and his name was Nabal. Now, sheep shearing time in ancient cultures, which the text tells us this was when it was. This was when wealthy people found out how much they actually had. Right? This was kind of like them getting their annual report. Nabal was about to find out just how much profit he's going to make for the year. The story continues. It says his name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. So the writer tells us right up front that Nabal is not a good guy, right? He's a mean person. And as we're going to see, he's a toxic person too. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. So when you show up, you make sure you tell Nabal, you're with me. You are speaking on my behalf. I am David," right? It says, say to him, "Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours." So this was just a typical greeting in ancient times. It was a simple way of saying, "Hello, I come in peace. Let's have a conversation." It says, now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. So in other words, he's saying, while your shepherds were out night after night watching over your flocks, throughout this season, our men, they were all around them all the time. And not only did we not steal anything from them, not only did we not harass them, we made sure nobody else did either. And it was just kind of typical in that day that people like this, like David and this group of guys that he had, that they would, one of the ways they kind of made a living was just by providing protection for people, for shepherds and wealthy people like this who needed to protect their property. And the expectation was that the owner of the flocks, when they made their money at sheep shearing time, they would compensate the men that provided this protection to them. It wasn't like a contractual agreement, but there was definitely that expectation that David and his guys would get paid for what they did. So David continues the message. Says, "Therefore, be favorable to my men, since we have come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." So he's saying, you're about to make some money. We kind of helped you make that money. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some of that with us so we can get by and we can make a living, and that would be great. When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and then they waited. And so they're sitting there, and they're waiting, right? And eventually, Nabal responds. And we don't know if he comes out and responds or if he sends somebody out like David did. But he responds with an answer, and here was an answer. Nabal answered David's servant, "Who is this David? Who is this son of David?" Or son of Jesse. And Nabal knew who David was. Everybody in Israel knew who David was. Nabal is saying, it's like, who is this David? He's a nobody to me. Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days, he says. And by that he's saying, your master is a nobody. Your master is an outlaw. I mean, I didn't ask for his help. I didn't need his help. I don't owe him anything, so I'm not going to share anything with David and his band of merry men, right? He says this, why should I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? David's men, they turned around and they went back. And when they arrived, they reported every word. And then David said to his men, okay, well, it was worth a try, right? No, he doesn't say that. The writer tells us this. He says, each of you strap on your sword. And so they did. He goes all Game of Thrones on them, right? And in other words, and then the writer gives us this interesting detail. In the text, he says this. He said, and David strapped his on as well. In other words, you mess with me, and you're going to find out. You mess with me, and I'm going to make you pay. Right? Now, I think there's a reason why the writer of 1 Samuel highlights David arming himself with his sword, because David's sword was like no other sword. David's sword was a reminder. It was a visible, tangible reminder that he did not need to return evil for evil. His sword was a reminder that he did not need to take matters into his own hands. Do you know where David's sword came from? Anybody? Yeah, it was Goliath's sword. Hey, just a few chapters back, we find out that he takes Goliath's sword. He's got this sword from Goliath. This was Goliath's sword, and it was, like I said, it was a visual aid of God's promise and protection and provision to David. God had chosen David. God had raised him up as a kid and as a young man, as a teenager, and he anointed him as a king, and he did not need to take matters into his own hands. And anyone on the planet at that time, of anybody, David is the one who could call on God for protection, who could call on God for help, and God would, in fact, intervene on his behalf. But David is hurt, and David is angry, and he can't see any of that. To him, it's just a really big sword, right? He's forgotten the story behind the sword, and he's forgotten God's provision because he's angry and he's hurt. And these toxic people, King Saul and Nabal, they have David off balance. And now he's compensating. And he redirects his anger that he has towards Saul. He redirects it towards Nabal. About 400 men, text tells us, about 400 men went up with David while 200 stayed with the supplies. And this is important detail. 400 men. This was an overreaction of epic proportion. This was going to be a massacre. I mean, you've heard the saying, hurt people. This is a case of hunted people hunt people. So David, he sets out, and as he sets out, he begins to build the case in his mind for why it's okay for him to go and get even with Nabal. I mean, have you ever done that? I've done that. I mean, somebody's hurt me, somebody's mistreated me, or somebody's mistreated somebody that I care about. You know, I can pretty quickly begin to build a case for why it's okay for me to lash out, for me to get even with that person. A little further down in this story, the writer tells us that David says this, that while they're on their way to see Nabal, he says to his guys, he says, it's been useless. All of my watching over this fellow's property. He's building up his case in the wilderness so that nothing of his was missing. David says, all the things I've done for him, all the nights that we stayed up guarding his sheep and his shepherds and his herds. Think of all the things he's thinking of that we could have stolen from him. Think about the wealth that we could have right now if we had not done the right thing. But what has he done for us? He says, he has paid us back evil for good. And then David invites God into the equation, but not in the way that he really should have. And he says, may God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. In other words, I'm going to kill Nabal. I'm going to kill his sons. I'm going to kill his male servants, and I'm going to kill their sons as well. That will teach him to treat me this way. Now, like I said, we're going to pause the story right there and pick it up next week. But here's what we have so far. We've got two characters in the story. We've got two responses, and we've got no hero, right? I mean, we have Nabal, right? And we have David. We have Nabal with evil for good, right? And David, David did good. Nabal responded with evil. David's about to respond with evil for evil, as we're about to see. And we have Nabal who was somewhat maniacal, right? David is about to be very predictable. I mean, and who could blame him for what he's about to do? Because sometimes it just seems like evil for evil is the only option that we have, especially when we're dealing with toxic, hateful, mean people. And as it turns out, it's not the only option, though. As we talked about, as I said earlier, there's a third option, and we're going to talk about that option next week. But here's what I want to do between now and next week. I want to give you 4 questions. I want to give you 4 questions to think about this week. And you don't have to do anything this week. Just think about these questions. And here's the first question that I want you to think about. You might want to snap a picture of this or write this down. But do you want to be even with someone you don't even like? And we all know the answer to that one right off the bat, don't we? No, we don't. I mean, but our natural response is just like David. Our natural response to people who hurt us is to get even with the people that we don't even like, to become like someone that we really would admit readily that we dislike. Question number 2, wouldn't you rather be ahead? I mean, instead of getting even with someone that you don't even like, wouldn't you rather be ahead? Wouldn't you prefer to be different from the people that you dislike, to be different from the toxic people in your life? You see, when it comes to relationships, here's the deal. You actually pull ahead when you refuse to get even. You end up in a better place. And that leads us to the third question, which is this. When this is nothing more than a story that you tell, what story do you want to tell? When this is nothing but a story down the road that one day you tell to other people, what story do you want to tell? When your response to this current relationship with this toxic person in your life, when it's nothing more than a story you're telling someone, what story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell a story that I ended up just like that person? I ended up just like a person that I didn't even like because I allowed them to get me so off balance that I reacted or I overreacted in a toxic way myself. I mean, that's not a good story. That's not a story any of us want to tell. And then the fourth question is basically the on-ramp to the solution we're going to look at next week. It's the on-ramp to pulling ahead of all of this. And the fourth question sets us up and puts us in this uncomfortable space. And it's a space that we probably should step into. We know we should step into it. If we're followers of Jesus, we know we're commanded to actually step into this space. But it's just so uncomfortable that it's difficult to do it. And the fourth question is this, and you don't have to commit to this. Like I said, just have an internal conversation about this week. But what would it look like to return good for evil? What would it look like? Not just to refuse to react or to react in like kind, but to actually be kind. Not to refuse to refuse to be bad, but to take seriously the words of Jesus, which were so direct that there's no misunderstanding what he meant by them when he said, I want you to do good to those who mistreat you. Don't just put up with them. Don't just forgive them. Don't just try to ignore them. Jesus says, that's not enough. He says, I want you to think through how to do good to those who mistreat you. Because Jesus knew that doing good to people who've not been good to us is ultimately what frees us. It's ultimately what protects us and protects our heart. Getting even is natural. It's predictable. Jesus has invited us to be unpredictable. Jesus has invited us to do something extraordinary. And Jesus has invited us to write a story that's worth telling. And what will determine whether that story is worth telling or not has nothing to do with what the other person does, because you can't control that. What determines if the story is worth telling is how we respond in these situations, and whether or not we respond in like kind or we decide to be kind. to do good to those who have mistreated us. Remarkable begins with an honest answer to this question of what would it look like to return good for evil? What would it look like to do good for that person who's mistreated you? Because you don't pull ahead by attempting to get even. And we're going to pick it up right there next week. So don't miss next week. Let me pray for you. God, we've all got people in our lives, either right now or we've had them in the past, and we're certain to have them in the future, who just aren't good people. I mean, they just aren't. They're mean, they're difficult, they're toxic. Some of them, maybe they're people at work, maybe they're family members, maybe they're neighbors, but they're people that we just can't walk away from the relationship because of the nature of the relationship. And so, God, I pray that you'd help us not only to not react in kind, but you would actually move each one of us as your followers to a place where we intentionally react with kindness, that we react with good to those who don't do good to us. Not because it's going to make us feel better, but because it's going to make us be better. And ultimately, God, maybe it will point them to you. It may not change the situation, but it will change us from the inside out. So I pray that you just give each one of us just the wherewithal this week to take a look at these questions and ask them some hard questions of ourselves as it connects to these people in our lives. And then, God, give us the strength to do the right thing. Give us the strength to truly follow you, what you did and what you said. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. I want to thank you for being here this morning. Don't forget to join us tonight at 5 o'clock right here if you can. If you can't join us in person, join us online. We'd love to have you be a part of this strategic planning process that we've been in for some time. Find a small group, join a small group. Talk to me later if you are wondering where can I find a small group. I'd love to connect you with one of our groups. Hope you have a great week wherever you find yourself. Let's stand and sing one more time as we head out.